Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. Welcome, dear listener, to this special episode in which Laura and I will be looking back over the books we've read during this past year. Our Christmas gift to you is this list of our standouts, from the page-turners we enjoyed the most to the novel that best pleased our inner critics, and not forgetting our picks for our best book club reads for discussion and debate. You'll also hear from some of the fantastic group of readers who make up our podcast book club over on Patreon, who share some of their standout reads of 2024. And check the link in the show notes for how to join the book club and support the pod on Patreon. From weekly bonus episodes to book club membership, come and supercharge your reading in 2025 and support me in making the podcast along the way. And speaking of support, a quick word about our episode sponsors, Serious Readers. As regular listeners may know, I do the bulk of my reading in bed before I go to sleep each night. After a day at work, and especially in the dark months of winter, I notice how tired my eyes get, and it can be difficult to focus. But one thing I find makes a huge difference is my Serious Readers lamp. I've had one for nearly a year now, and I cannot imagine life without it. What makes their light special is that they feature daylight wavelength technology, which replicates the daylight spectrum. What that means is your eyes are getting exactly the right light that they need, which means you find it easier to see and to concentrate. Perfect for a tired reader with a mountainous TBR. Their lamps are beautifully engineered and elegantly designed, but they are an investment, which is why, if you're interested to try them for yourself, you should visit seriousreaders.com/BCR and use our offer code BCR at checkout for £100 off any HD light. You can trial them for 30 days and see for yourself what a difference they make. Find the link for full details in the show notes or on our episode page at thebookclubreview.co.uk. Right, mountainous TBR, you say? Let's find out why. "2024, the year of a new Sally Rooney novel, Intermezzo. But that didn't interfere with sales of We Solved Murders by Richard Osman, if the UK bestseller list is anything to go by. Page-turning summer standouts were The Ministry of Time in the UK and The God of the Woods in the US. This was the year romantasy became a thing, as Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros continued to top the charts. On the more highbrow end of the scale, the Booker Prize was won by British novelist Samantha Harvey for her short novel Orbital, surprising fans of hotly tipped favourite James by Percival Everett. But that's okay, because he then won the National Book Award in the US. Phew. In the non-fiction world, Australian Richard Flanagan won the Baillie Gifford Prize for his memoir Question 7. While German author Jenny Erpenbeck and her translator Michael Hoffman won the Booker International for her novel Kairos. Realising the world can be a terrifying and scary place, cosy fiction came to the fore, with people hoovering up books like The Pumpkin Spice Cafe and The Marigold Mind Laundry. For me, 2024 has been a year of music, with Clemency Burton Hill and her Year of Wonder listening selections, and a late-stage dive into the world of self-help, with Oliver Burkeman and his Meditations for Mortals. But what were the standouts? The books we couldn't put down, the ones we rushed to tell people about. Laura's dialing in from Vancouver, I'm here in London. Join us to find the best books we read in 2024. Laura, so nice to see you, as ever. I'm less in touch with your day-to-day reading than I used to be, and so I'm genuinely interested and curious to find out all your favourite books from this past year. How's 2024 been for you as a reading year? Do you feel like you read more, less?
I think I read worse, which is a little bit depressing. Interesting hearing you sum up the year, though, because perhaps I just leaned into some of the trends that others are feeling. I definitely read some cozy fiction. I read Days at the Morisaki Bookshop, which I really liked. A similar vein, another novel by a Japanese writer was What You're Looking For Is in the Library. These are like short, slim, heartwarming reads. I also read Legends and Lattes, which is cozy fantasy. And then I read a lot of romance. I read all of Emily Henry this year. I don't think we've talked about that.
Yeah, I've never read her.
The queen of the somewhat classy romance novel. There's still a lot of sex, but hey, that's the point of the genre. And then I read a lot of science fiction. And I don't feel too sheepish about that, but I think I really wanted to escape in my reading, and I didn't read as many challenging, maybe even challenging is not fair, but just those books where you're like, oh, I'm going to take this on, and you enjoy it, and you feel like you've accomplished something and enriched yourself. That was not my reading year.
Yeah, it's funny what we need from the books we turn to at different times. And I definitely also have been conscious this year of wanting a bit more escapism and also, yeah, definitely a bit more coziness. If the world is a arbitrary and increasingly terrifying place, the very least, when we open books to read before bed at night, you want it to be something that wraps you up like a warm hug. And yet, at the same time, ultimately, it's still true that the books that bring me the most pleasure are the ones that I feel are a bit of a challenge, that you have to wrestle with some new ideas, or you have to follow a complicated plot, or you're appreciating writing that stands out because it's so beautiful and elevated. And ultimately, they're the ones that leave you with something enriching. The other books, there is absolutely a place for them. I think they're really important, but they pass by in a way that these books, some books, lodge in your heart and change you slightly. And that's always what I'm looking for, what I'm hoping for every time I pick up a book. I haven't read as much this year. That's the other thing I've noticed. I made the usual attempt to keep a list, failed as usual, so all of that is completely par for the course. But I've scrabbled together a spreadsheet, and then going back through it, I was struck by how many books I hadn't finished. Not because I wasn't enjoying them, but I think I've had less time this year and more of a sense of not being able to get through everything I've wanted to read. And so there are books that actively I was really loving that I've only half read. I know I want to go back to them. I know I want to finish them. But at the moment, they're open. I'm not calling them DNFs. They're not DNFs. They're ongoing concerns.
I also would reflect that we don't have a really great large bookshop in Vancouver. And I do think that trusted bookshop is really critical in helping you find the novels that might stretch you, to your point, or that will just offer something a little bit different. That browsing experience of going forth and exploring. I picked up a lot of books in grocery stores because that's my easiest access. And they're grocery store books. Of course, they're fluffy, and I devour them in one fell swoop. I also feel like my book club, we haven't met quite as much this year. That's really on me more than anything. All of which is to say, I don't want to be too downbeat right before we get into the best books. There were some good reads, but I am full of New Year's resolutions when it comes to what to read in 2025. And quite frankly, hopefully, just like listeners, I'm here to hear what other people enjoyed so that maybe I can hit the ground running.
I have been beautifully prepped for all of this because last night I met with the Patreon book clubbers. Instead of reading something for this month, we decided we would meet and talk through our standout books of the year. And I threw it open to both tiers. Normally, book clubbers are just the higher tier people, which is a smaller group. But for this one, I threw it open to everybody. And so it was so great. I got to meet lots of people who I know by name, but I hadn't seen their faces before. And they were giving me their recommendations. So I have theirs in mind as well. So I'll weave a few of those in as we go through our categories. First up, most enjoyable book. The book that you really relished. You were able to sit back and enjoy the ride. What's the book that fits into that category for you?
It was a serendipitous discovery. The book is called Loot by Tanya James, and some listeners may recall, certainly Kate will recall, that I attended the Vancouver Public Library's Rooftop Remix in September, where everyone brings a book to leave behind, and then you're empowered to take one or more books, because there are many left over, in my defense. I took 3. And I picked up Loot by Tanya James. Loot is the story of the 17-year-old woodworker in Seringa-Patna, Mysore, in 1794. And he is recruited to the palace to build a giant tiger automaton for Tipu Sultan's son. Now, I worked at the V&A in my 20s, and anyone who has visited the V&A may know of Tipu's tiger, which is this wooden automaton. So this is the fictionalized story of how that came to be made. It was a collaboration between the French clockmaker, Lucien Deleuze, and in terms of the historical record, it's assumed an unnamed local woodworker. It's a romping, rollicking retelling of a historical moment. And there is heartache and disease and trauma and all these things, but told in such a way that you don't feel too depressed necessarily. The power of the human spirit comes through. And ultimately, Abbas ends up in France, then he's in the UK. There's a piece around trying to get Tipu's tigers back. It was a really delightful, enjoyable read. Really well written. I think Tanya James is a great writer. A really fascinating period of time. A great commentary on colonialism. Tipu Sultan fell shortly after 1796, shortly after the tiger was created. And he was a leader who had great ambitions for his empire to rival Europe. And then the British came in and tore it all down, and he was killed. I liked it a lot. I should say, so did lots of other people. On the back cover, Lauren Groff gave it a rave review. So did Rebecca Mackey, author of The Great Believers, but also the one I read this year, I Have Something to Tell You.
I can never remember the title of that book by her either. I know exactly the book you mean.
I Have Something to Tell You.
Yes.
I have something to, but it's not quite that. I feel like there's a negative in there. What I should say is that not only did I work at the V&A, so I know Tipu's tiger, as I was reading this book, I was like, there's so many things in here that feel really familiar. And I realized it's because I edited a book about Tipu's tiger when I was about 22. I hope I just proofread it, because otherwise it's a big gap in my memory that only came back from being nudged along by this story. It was great. It was a really enjoyable historical novel, and I was very delighted to have found it.
I Have Some Questions for You was the name of the Rebecca Mackay novel.
I have some questions
that I can never remember the title of. I realised I always love novels where they touch on something in the real world when it's well done. That's my caveat. It has to be well done. But when it is well done and there is a real world reference, I always really love and appreciate that. One of the books we're going to come on to later, I feel gets into that zone a little bit. I had a couple. One I've already talked about on the pod at length, and that was a very pleasant surprise. It was recommended by a podcast patron, Nicola, who has become a very trusted source for book recommendations, particularly after this, which was such a hit. And that is Greta and Valdin by Rebecca K. Riley, who is a New Zealand author. I believe this might even be a debut novel. It's just a delight. It's not quite like anything I'd ever read. It's very quirky, but not in an annoying way, or I didn't think so anyway, a charming way. It's got these two main characters who are siblings. It's about their lives, and both of them are on a bit of a romantic quest, their relationships as they seek to find love and a place for themselves in the world. They're young, they're early 20s. So it's a coming-of-age story for both of them, but they're embedded in this family network of parents and uncles and aunts and cousins and friends, and they're all incredibly cosmopolitan and multicultural. They come from all different places around the world, and it's all coalescing in this family house. And then lots of very well-observed characters and comedic set pieces that constantly surprised me. I never knew where she was going with any of it. Actually, not that much happens. It's not a super plotty book. It's more the pleasure of being with these characters and the appreciation of how well Rebecca Riley has captured it all on the page. It was a real delight, that book. The other one I wanted to mention, which I haven't talked about on the pod, which I read quite recently, which I think is quite up your street, is another romantic comedy. It's called The Wedding People by Alison Esbach. This is not a little book that no one's heard of. I believe this has been a bestseller in the States. And I idly picked it up after all those Booker books, feeling like I needed something that was not going to challenge or alarm me in any way. And it's got this quite contrived setup. It's about a middle-aged woman. She's a professor of Victorian literature, and her husband has walked out on her. She's dealing with the aftermath of this, and she heads off to a hotel. You think to treat herself, it seems like a nice thing she's doing, but she has quite a different agenda, in fact, that you learn about why she's gone to this hotel by the sea. But when she gets there, she discovers that the entire hotel has been booked out for a wedding, and she is the only guest who isn't part of the bride and groom's party. And for the reasons that you quickly understand, she's not prepared to give up on going to this place. She had a reason why she wanted to go there, and she's going to stay. The bride doesn't want her there and is basically trying to get rid of her. And she, meanwhile, slightly against her own inclination, starts getting drawn into the different social dynamics that are going on with this wedding party. I didn't think it was brilliant. My breath wasn't taken away by the writing or anything like that. In some ways, it was quite workmanlike, and often I was a little bit uneasy about the way she does dialogue, which I didn't always love. But this character, this central character, I was really captivated by, and what she does really brilliantly is this sense of weaving in these deeper ideas of literature, and particularly novels written by women from the past. And all of that academic side is woven in very lightly. But the fact that it's there, and almost every time I wanted to dismiss this character as being very lightweight and the whole thing being incredibly fluffy, there would be a little paragraph or phrase about this woman's trying to come to a new sense of herself after this complete total disruption of everything that she had thought was a certain sure thing in her life. And now who is she? What is she? What can she become, kind of thing. I loved all of that. I thought it was really beautifully handled. And ultimately, I loved the arc the character goes on. And it was also a fun, sit back and enjoy the read romantic comedy that I thought had a bit of bite and depth. And actually, in that moment, was exactly what I wanted. I bought it for my mother-in-law for her birthday because I just thought, I just want to pass on this happy reading experience that I've had. But I haven't heard back yet to see if it landed as well with her as it did with me.
I feel like that would fit very well into my current reading habits. But I'm also like, I feel like I've eaten too much candy and I now need to have a delicious kale salad.
Yes.
So maybe I need to just like push that back a little bit.
That, of course, we both have Olga Tokarczuk, don't we? The Impusium, which you're reading for book club and I am reading it along. I had almost exactly the same thought. I've been on this real fantasy trip, little field trip for the past week and a half. And last night, it's just like, this has to end. I can't read anymore. I need something that's fine literature sort of thing. And picked up the Impusium and read the first couple of chapters this morning and had that real sense of like, yeah, this is good for me. I'm enjoying this.
It's quite dreary and claustrophobic though.
I know. We'll see.
We're going to discuss that in a few weeks, listeners.
Yeah, we'll put a little post-it note on that one and come back to it. Okay, from most enjoyable reads to a little bit of a tweak, best page turner. For me, this category has slightly more of a propulsive edge. Book you couldn't put down, book you were racing through and just couldn't wait to get to the end to find out what happened. What would fall into that category for you?
This book has already been mentioned in your introduction, and it is The Ministry of Time by Kalyan.
Oh,
Bradley.
Really?
Have you read that? Did you ever read
but
it?
I'm just surprised that that's making the best. I was...
I found it a page turner. It was my best page
quite
turner.
critical of the Ministry of Time.
But I feel that is my fault. I feel like I enjoyed it so much.
It wasn't your fault.
And then it's about expectations. And so I read it without any expectations and loved it. It's part spy thriller. It's time travel novel. It's got romance. It's quite funny. The ending is slightly ridiculous, but to be clear, this is about page turning. And I roared through it and then messaged you and Phil saying how much I enjoyed it and how I'd raced through it. And then I feel inevitably you both came back in due course poo-pooing it and how it wasn't very good. Which, to be clear, I might have done if you guys had told me it was really good. But I read it full steam ahead, no internal critic, just loved it. And I really enjoyed the narrator. I enjoyed the period set pieces. The premise of this novel is that our protagonist works in the civil service. She works for the Home Office in the UK, and she gets recruited with a really big salary into a new department. And there she learns that she is going to be what they call a bridge, basically a minder for a time traveler, because somehow, I think there's about 7 of them, 7 time travelers from the past 500 years or so have ended up in London in present day. And the Home Office needs someone to look after them, monitor them, and help them to adjust to the 21st century. And she is paired up with a very handsome, intrepid explorer who is a real individual.
Graham Gore.
That's the one, Graham Gore, who, in terms of the historical record, died on Sir John Franklin's 1845 expedition to the Arctic. And that's the premise, is that these time travelers have been pulled out of time at a moment of their death so that it should not interrupt the time-space continuum. I found the tension between these two characters very compelling, and I was absolutely hooked. I thought the ending didn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'm not sure time travel endings ever make a whole lot of sense, really. So I was with the mainstream. I've loaned my copy out to people in my office who have also enjoyed it.
You're right. I remember I enjoyed it too, although I felt like it didn't quite deliver on its early promise. But I gave a copy to my friend Nina, who's appeared on this podcast in the past. I'd given it to her a couple of months back and forgotten all about it. And she texted me the other day, I am enjoying The Ministry of Time so much. I'm having to read it in small bites. I'm distraught at the idea it will end. Thank you. And it made me laugh because I'd forgotten, or in my own mind, I'd perhaps dismissed the Ministry of Time and moved on. But then I remembered, you know what, I was sufficiently engaged with it that I did avidly go round this exhibition I found in the Met Museum when I was over in New York in the summer about the Franklin. And I was like forensically combing through all the little bits of information because ultimately I was pretty captivated by that whole story.
What's your page turner? Let's see if I can mock it.
You can't, because I know you like it too. This was the year that I discovered N.K. Jemisin and the 5th season, which I read because it was on the New York Times notable books list. I had misfiled it in that you were able to tick off the books that you'd read. I thought I had read it. And then when I actually reread the Kindle sample, I realized, oh, hang on a minute, I haven't read this. What am I talking about? But then by that point, I was hooked. And I basically then read the whole thing. Absolutely loved it and was so impressed by it. It's set in this far distant future. There's this geological instability that means that life is quite tenuous and difficult, and societies are almost living in quite a medieval way, but there are certain people who have the ability to control the earthquakes, and these people are very feared and tightly controlled. And the main character is someone who is very strong in this ability. And so it's about someone learning about this power that they have within themselves and what their role is in changing this world, I suppose. That's the story. It's pretty epic. And you get so drawn in and swept along. And I read that one. I read the second one, The Obelisk Gate. I actually then stopped only because they are quite dark. And I was starting to find that a bit hard. There's a lot of death and destruction. And it was starting to feel a little bit grim. But it was never because I didn't think they weren't good, because they were such great reads. And the first one had a really propulsive quality. But the one I wanted to flag up was actually non-fiction. I don't think I talked about it on the pod. Maybe I did. It's Going Infinite by Michael Lewis. This is his book about a cryptocurrency convicted fraudster, Sam Bankman-Fried, who set up this company, SFX, and actually had a pretty brilliant idea for how to set up his own cryptocurrency exchange and then charge a commission on all the transactions that were being made. So, of course, it absolutely made so much money. The interesting thing about Sam Bankman-Fried was that he wasn't interested in making money for personal gain. He was interested in making money so that he could use it to do good in the world, which is this philosophy called effective altruism. You earn to give, basically. He had another company, and there was a bit of turned out to be a massive discrepancy in where the money was going between these two companies, and ultimately billions were lost, and the whole thing collapsed, and he was found to have been guilty of fraud. But Michael Lewis, just so happened, had decided to write a book about Sam Bankman-Fried and had been granted this very close access. He was in the room at many crucial moments during the story of this last year of this company's rise and fall. And in fact, he doesn't quite see it through to the very end because the book stops before the actual trial and ultimate conviction. So you never really quite find out. And then what's brilliant is, because this is a true life story, you can then go and follow up on podcasts and hear more of the story and what happened next. You, I think, had flagged it up and had been a little bit more measured about it. We're both huge Michael Lewis fans. And I remember when you read it, I think you didn't love it as much as some other things that you'd read by him. And so when I idly started listening to it, I started listening to the audiobook, my expectations were not that high. I was really feeling like I was checking it off. I hadn't necessarily really committed to sitting down and reading it. And I was so swept along. I really enjoyed the way he told the story. I was so fascinated by this character, Sam, how very eccentric he was, brilliant, but also by no normal standards of behavior, anything that you could really relate to or fit him into. I think Michael Lewis is at his best with these oddball characters and strange types of people that don't quite fit the mold anywhere else. And I thought all of that really allowed him to do what he's best at, which is exploring who is this individual and what makes him tick. And at the end, a lot of the criticism about the book after it was published was that Michael Lewis had got too close to his subject, that he wasn't taking a critical enough position, and that he should have been more objective. Listening to him talk about the book, I'm totally on his side. He is very unapologetic about the fact that he never set out to do anything else other than answer the question, who is Sam Bankman-Fried? It was not his purpose or intent to make any value judgments about what Fried was doing or whether or not he should be found guilty. And instead, the book does what Lewis says he's trying to do, which is just tell you about this character and give you, I think, a lot of... The other thing he's so brilliant at is boiling down in layman's terms, in terms that you really can grasp and understand, this completely opaque world of electronic trading and units of currency that seem to have no correspondence in reality, right? It's all about what people believe something is worth. And he does a great job of explaining all of that, because that's the other thing he's really good at. He's really good at characters and he's really good at explaining things. And it is a total page turner. I thought it was a brilliant book. I absolutely loved it.
Well, you've just stolen my whole spiel for my favorite nonfiction of 2024.
Oh, are you going to do Going Infinite?
Now, to be clear, I don't read that much nonfiction, so the list was not long. I do recall being a little bit critical that it wasn't his best book, and I think I would still say that's true, but I don't read a lot of nonfiction. I always read Michael Lewis. I think he's an exceptional storyteller. And if I could add anything to this, I would just say that he never really believes that Sam Bankman-Fried has stolen money. He says, the money's lost, and you use that word. He's like, the money's lost, but I bet you anything it's going to be found. And I saw him write more recently after publication, after the case, all of these things. The money has been found. I know. They were so incompetent. They just lost money. They would have $1 billion over there, $300 million over there. They just had zero bookkeeping to keep track of it.
And the investigators, the investigative team who come in to try and mop up all this business are also pretty incompetent in that they just don't have all the facts. And so you're in this delicious position, along with Lewis, of knowing so much background. At the end of that book, you think pretty much two people know where that money is. Sam Bankman-Fried and Michael Lewis. He doesn't know where it is. He just knows it's somewhere.
And they found it.
And they found it. I love that.
I also liked how Michael Lewis lifts the lid towards the end on the incentives for financial lawyers to make it a case. There's huge lobbying to bring Sam Bankman-Fried back to the US because they want the case to be in the US, because these financial lawyers will make hundreds of millions of dollars over this bankruptcy. And it's funny because Michael Lewis is not cynical about these things. He's just exposing it for what it is, lifting the lid and letting you make your own judgments about how you feel about it.
Over to the book clubbers, and Pat had been enjoying Alice Wynn's prize-winning debut novel, In Memoriam.
A great book that was fiction about World War I and two gay soldiers writing to each other and loving each other and dealing with the horrors of war. But it was a page-turner.
Meanwhile, Andrew was reporting back on his experience reading All Fours by Miranda July. I was interested to hear a male perspective on her hit perimenopause novel.
I just find it fascinating and super immersive and interesting. A lot of it takes place more or less in the same location, but it's just so interesting in terms of the characters and what's going on in her life and his life and how they're...
This is this motel room that she's sort of appropriated, hasn't she, and decorated.
Yes. Yeah, when she's supposed to have gone to New York for work, for business, she makes it to the next town and then redecorates this motel room for like 20 grand. Is there for 2 weeks and sort of is in this relationship with this guy who works at Hertz, but it's not, there's sort of, anyway, it's really interesting. I keep wanting to know what happens, so good page turner.
And my other book clubbing Andrew Kay, offered up a contemporary classic.
I think my best page turner of the year was Olga Tokarczuk's Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead. It was almost an unlikely page turner. I've not read many Nobel laureates, and I was expecting something quite high-powered and taking more effort to have to try and read it. and actually just gallop through it. There's lots of depth to it, but it actually made an amazingly good story, which I kept wanting to turn, and I crashed through it in less than 48 hours. Amazing book.
About it. What's your best nonfiction then? Because we're going to skip me. You stole mine. We've given Going Infinite more than perhaps it's due. What was your favorite nonfiction?
Most of my favorite reads this past year have been nonfiction, which was interesting when I totted it up. It was very easy for me to think of nonfiction reads that were complete standouts for me, and I really struggled to think of fiction that I had really loved. I've got a bit of recency bias because I feel like it's the things that I've read most recently that have stuck with me the most strongly. But I was remembering How to Say Babylon by Sophia Sinclair, which I read before the summer, I think. That is incredibly engaging. And that's a page-turner memoir about growing up as the child of a family where the father was a very strict, hardline Rastafarian. And you learn a lot about Rastafarianism through the course of reading the book, and you learn what that means. There are different degrees to which people practice that religion, and he was someone who was very absolute. And unfortunately for Sophia and her mother, women are expected to be seen and not heard. They are not really expected to have an education. They're expected to be the helpers in the home and look after their menfolk kind of thing. And there's two extraordinary people in this story. One is Sophia, who is very bright and quite a special person, I think, in lots of ways. But her mother is there in the background, and it was not easy. You could tell this woman had such a difficult, challenging life. But wherever she could, she made sure that her children were learning and that they were exposed to poetry and literature and things that she knew would nourish them in the way that I think those things had nourished her. Sophia eventually, whatever little crumbs of opportunity she gets, she eagerly takes. And eventually she gets to a point where it's her poetry, in fact, that ends up being her way out. But it is not easy, and it's an extraordinary story. It's very vividly written. You feel like you're there in Jamaica. And it has that other thing that I think lifted it into something really excellent, which is that although her father was a very difficult man and often his behavior really was quite monstrous, there's this undercurrent of compassion and empathy and trying to understand why he was the way he was, even as they were really very bitterly opposed. And so I loved all that. It was a really fantastic read that really swept me along while I was reading it. I loved it. And then just very quickly, I really enjoyed Grief is for People by Sloane Crosley, which is a slim little book. Again, memoir. Partly I loved it because she worked in the publishing industry for many years. She was a publicist at, I think it was Vintage or Penguin or somewhere. So working with big name authors, and the grief is actually for her friend Russell, who was her boss in this publishing company and someone that she loved to be around, someone who was very fun and very charismatic and had a very kind of unique take on life. And unfortunately, he died by suicide. It was a complete shock. She didn't see it coming. No one did, really. And so partly this book is about her trying to come to terms with that loss and understand why it might have happened and if there was anything she could have done differently, whether that might have changed the outcome. But it's also a story, a very funny story, about some jewellery that she loses in a burglary in her apartment. She didn't even like the jewellery. It belonged to her grandmother. It was very ugly and no one even liked the grandmother very much. So this jewellery should not have had any sentimental attachment. But this loss, on the one hand, it's a story about this loss of this jewellery, and on the other, this loss of this very special person. And it's funny. It's beautifully written. I loved her and the world. It was really great. And I just thought, yeah, quite a special book. But yeah, the one I really would be Book of the Year. And I'm spending a bit more time on nonfiction, only just, as I said, because these were my really standouts, I think, was The Garden Against Time by Olivia Laing, which I talked about in our summer reading show, which is her story of restoring a walled garden in a house that she and her husband moved to in Suffolk. And she takes that process, that kind of practical process of working with this garden, understanding the soil, understanding what it needs, and following the plan of the previous person who originally created the garden, who was quite a celebrated garden designer of his day, and then looks at the garden through history. So in literature, thinking about things like Milton and Paradise Lost, and then she looks at contemporary writers like Derek Jarman and his garden at Dungeness that he crafted from this shingle. And she weaves in politics and the idea of privilege and that gardens are not for everyone. They're private spaces and not everyone has a garden. And things like that quite acutely came to the fore in lockdown, didn't they, when not everyone had access to green outdoor space. It's so beautifully written. I just loved it. Why did I love it so much? I'm not much of a gardener. I do have a garden. I don't really know what to do with it. I loved reading about someone who did know what to do with her garden. So on a practical level, I really love that. But also I loved it as a way into the past and the cultural world. That was great. I could go on. There was All That Glitters by Orlando Whitfield, which I loved. There was Thunderclap by Laura Cumming, which I loved. It was a big year of really great nonfiction reads for me. Wifedom. I'll stop.
Well, they all do sound really good. I think that nonfiction is such a weighty term, isn't it? If you'd said favorite memoir, I would be much more engaged. Or musings, right? So I don't know. Nonfiction always sounds like it's going to have something on the record and a bit dry about it. That's my preconceptions of it.
Of course, the book club has also had some non-fiction picks, although Charlotte surprised me with her first choice.
I've just finished this and I can't say enough good things about it.
Really? That looks like the sort of thing Phil would read. Bart Bamboo, is it? The Burgundians. It's very thick.
Yeah, it is. It's very thick. It's 514 pages, but it's been such a joy to read.
Really?
It's all about the Dukes of Burgundy in the Middle Ages and the conflicts they had with England and with Spain and how the Low Countries formed as a state almost. And the characters in it are so vividly drawn, you feel like you've met them, and it's just so readable for a history book. Really very good.
Meanwhile, just to prove that everyone finds different things to love in books, Carol had a favourite that I hadn't got on so well with. Maurice and Marilyn by Sophie Elmhurst.
Which is the story of two people who decided to sell their old house and build a boat and try and sail all the way to New Zealand and then get caught in a storm. And it's a story of them surviving. I know, Kate, you didn't like all the lists in it.
Yes, lots and lots of lists of stuff, but I loved it. For the drama. I saw that Tom Rowley of Backstory, that was one of his books of the year. I know that he really loved that one.
Yeah, one of his fiction ones I really enjoyed as well. So I think Tom and I seem to feel on the same page. But yeah, I loved Maurice and Marilyn. Because I don't read a lot of non-fiction.
Like sort of true life adventure stories.
Yeah.
While Lita singled out Rachel Clark's book Story of a Heart, which tracks the process of a heart transplant through the intertwined stories of two extraordinary children.
I've never cried in a book before. I'm not a crier when I read, and it was so beautifully written. And the interweaving of the medical history and the development of medical science over the centuries was absolutely fascinating. And I kept thinking, how's she telling this incredibly poignant story? And it was a page-turning story. It was honestly the most beautiful read, and I have recommended it to quite a few people. Beautiful book, really fantastic.
Okay, the next category is close to our hearts. It is the best book club book of the year.
Are you still in 2 book clubs?
I am still in 2 book clubs. I'm still in my London book club, and we meet online probably like once every 2 months. And then I am in the Vancouver book club, but I've been quite a bad participant. And I was actually going to ask my friend and colleague whether I've been too bad because I've had to miss quite a few because of other commitments. That's true of the upcoming one. If I go, I've always read the book, but sometimes I won't go because I haven't read the book. So I don't know. I'm wondering if maybe 2 book clubs is too much. You need to have some time for your own choices.
Yeah, 2 book clubs is a lot. I was in 2 book clubs for a while, and I think it is a lot.
We had some good reads, though, this year. I should say my London book club, we had some good reads this year. And this is the one spot where I do have a couple that I wanted to name drop. The first is Enter Ghost by Isabel Hamid.
I feel like so many people have told me that's great.
It's not perfect, but it's really good. When you were talking earlier about books that expand your horizons, fill you up with an understanding of a very complex situation, with a maturity and grace that doesn't feel, I don't want to say one-sided, but just feels very nuanced. Enter Ghost is about a British Palestinian woman who's been working as an actress in London, and her sister and her were raised in the UK, but her sister chose to return to Israel and to live in Israel as a Palestinian woman. And the story kicks off with our protagonist following an ill-fated love affair with a director, going to stay with her sister and lick her wounds. And the protagonist is quite annoying in some ways. She's very well realized. She feels like a fully fledged human being. There's lots to like about her. She's also annoying. There's something of the actress in her, like it does fulfill some preconceptions about that personality type. And her sister, who's an academic in Israel, is very much the grown-up in that dynamic. And even the set pieces when she first arrive and the irritation that they fill each other with is very well done. But then our main character, Sonia, is recruited by her sister's friend to be a part of a production of Hamlet in the West Bank. And therefore she has to travel into Palestine through the security checks, and she stays there while they do the rehearsals. And then the story just goes on from there. I don't want to give too much away because I think it's how it unfolds and the subtlety with which it unfolds and the way that Hamlet integrates with this exploration about life in Palestine and Israel. That's exceptionally well done. It was a really good book club book. I would highly recommend it. I thought I knew about Palestine and Israel, and then I read this novel and realized I knew nothing in terms of the intricacies of everything. So I would recommend it. The other one, I'll just be brief here because we talked about it recently, is The Safekeep, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Did not win, but we talked about it on that episode. Quite a fun book club book. We had much to say. It's a little bit flawed. I think I throw it into the mix because it's probably the book club book with the most sex that anyone will ever read. And I quite enjoyed the book club dynamic, as we talked about that. The Brits versus the Americans versus the Canadians, the different cultural responses. And it's a worthwhile book. I'm glad it didn't win the Booker Prize, but I think it is a good one. But my best book club book, and I think my book club would agree with this, is Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. I don't know if we ever really talked about this on the pod this year.
I think that I feel like there's been WhatsApp back and forth, but we haven't talked about it in person. I have a copy of it upstairs, which I got at the Keats Library book sale the other week, with that endorsement from you and Phil and Martin, I think, in mind, because you'd all told me it was good.
It is good. It was winner of the Goldsmiths Prize of 2023, and it is a series of stories, all relating to St. Cuthbert, who is the patron saint of Northern England, and who is affectionately known as Cuddy. And it starts with the prologue, AD 687, which is the year that St. Cuthbert died. He had retreated to a rock, a small island off the coast of Northern England, and was already being revered as a saint, or it was headed in that direction. And it starts off in a very bitty prose style that when I first read it, and then indeed the next section, which takes us forward to AD 985, I thought, good Lord, how am I going to get through this novel? And that was the response of most people in book club. But what we didn't know is that the stories, it's hard to describe them. Imagine that there's 12 stories in this novel. They span from AD 687 to the present day, and they're all about St. Cuthbert in some vein, or about his teachings, or about what he means, or indeed about the cathedral that rose up around his remains in Durham. And the prose style changes. This is very important, because when you start off the first 30 pages, you're thinking, no, I'm not going to be able to get on with this. But what Benjamin Myers has done is he's written in the style of the time period. And so for a lover of literature, and indeed if you've got an English degree or two, there's a real pleasure in transitioning between the different prose styles and to see him riffing off of the genres of those times. And there's a huge amount of heart in this book. The final sequence, really in austerity England, just breaks your heart, but it brings it full circle. And for being about a Christian saint, I feel like there's something for everyone in this book. It's really just about humanity and kindness and human connection. We loved it. Loved it. And I don't even think you can get it in North America.
How did you get your copy then?
I think my mum brought it back. Or you sent it to me, but maybe it was my mom.
no, not me.
I think
Not
my
me,
mom
because
did.
I
think she was in the UK and I messaged her.
picked it up and looked at it in the bookshop, and I think I probably had opened it at the difficult, hard to engage with section. And so I snapped it shut, and it's quite long as well, isn't it? And it was like, that, not for me.
Yeah, don't be put off.
That's good to know, especially as I've got a copy sitting upstairs waiting for me. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting to that. I realise I already mentioned my best book club book. We read some great things for the podcast book club this year. We did The Frauds, A.D. Smith. We did Sarah Bakewell's book, Humanly Possible, which is a history of humanism, which is a wonderful read. Deborah Levy's book, August Blue, which I felt like there wasn't maybe as much to it as I really wanted there to be after those wonderful autobiographies, but it's definitely the novel of hers I think I've enjoyed the most. It's got a lot of that sense of playfulness that is in those living autobiography books that we all love so much. So I did enjoy that. We started the year in Japan. This book, Mild Vertigo by Mieko Kanai, or Kanai Mieko, as the Japanese would say, which is almost deceptively slim little Fitzcarraldo book. But the writing is amazing, and it was a really interesting book that wasn't quite like anything else, and I was pleased to have discovered it, and I wouldn't have read it left to my own devices. That's what I love book club for, is getting me to pick things up that I wouldn't necessarily pick up. But I think this one is the one for me. Wifedom by Australian author Anna Funder. Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life is the subtitle. It's about George Orwell's wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, about whom not that much is known, mainly because Orwell hardly ever mentioned her or wrote about her, and she didn't leave much behind herself. But there were these letters, not many of them, something like 8 or 10 letters that she wrote that has been preserved. I think there was a lot more, but he burned it all after she died. And it had that thing I love where I feel like this is a bit Marmitey, but I always really enjoy this, where the author puts themselves into the story and you get a sense of the writer uncovering this story, working on this story. And so Anna Funder's motivation for being intrigued about the life of Eileen was that she herself was very busy, and she has children and had a lot of domestic responsibilities she was juggling, and also looking after parents who were older. And she was really struggling to keep her head above water with it all, and to carve out time to do the thing she really wanted to do, which was write. And somehow in this feeling of frustration about this struggle that she was experiencing, she found herself wondering about Orwell's wife. There's a reason why she was interested in Orwell in the first place, who she just reasoned must have been incredibly important. She must have been. And from that premise of who was this woman and why is there nothing about her when she clearly was such a big part of his life, what can I find out? And so it starts this process of exploration and bringing Eileen back to life, recovering her story, bringing it back into the body of knowledge and understanding about Orwell, of which there's a lot. The thing that made it a good book club book was the way it was done. Because there's hardly anything of Eileen in her own words, what Anna Funder decided to do was to imagine. So there are scenes in this book where it's how Eileen might have been feeling, what she might have said, what she might have done. There's no rock solid evidence, but Funder's taking all the evidence that she has and then piecing together. And so for me, that really worked. I really liked those sections, and I thought it really added to my sense of engagement and absorption in the world of this book. And it had that thing, it had that really, seems like a miraculous thing where, thanks to Anna Funder and this work, I believe it's not the only book about Eileen O'Shaughnessy. There is another one someone else has written who had, I think, a similar idea. But this is a really wonderful book, and it does bring her back. And you realise this woman who's been lost is now here on the page, and she was amazing. She's really extraordinary, very bright, very capable woman who went out with Orwell to Spain during the Civil War and had a key role, a sort of administrative role. I thought it was a really wonderful book club read, and I'm not sure I would have read it if it hadn't been for book club getting me to pick it up. But I'm excited about book club next year because this year I programmed the books thinking it would be important to be able to say to people, okay, here's what we're reading over the year, and then people could decide what they wanted to join in for or not. But of course, what that took away was that lovely feeling you have with book club where you're reading something you wouldn't choose for yourself. And so next year, we're going to go to a voting system where people are going to nominate books. We will choose one, and then we will read that book. I'm excited about having books chosen for me again. So yeah, that's going to be good. I'm looking forward to that.
How do people get involved, Kate?
Every month over Zoom, 9 p.m. London time, you can dial in and talk books with me and this wonderful group of people who I've grown very fond of. They're really a highlight at the end of every month. Just go to the Patreon page and you'll see how to sign up and what we might be tackling in the year to come. No, you won't see that actually because we don't know yet, but we're going to do 3-month blocks because I think people do need a bit of advance warnings. That was my thought, was we would block in 3 months and then we'll have a vote on the next 3 months and we'll see how that goes. As for the book clubbers, Nicola chose Question 7 by Richard Flanagan, which won this year's Baillie Gifford Prize.
It is thought-provoking and I think a really good one to discuss what you think are the strengths and weaknesses. It's got reviews in Australia with some reviewers saying it's his best book ever. There's a very well-known Australian author who's won the Booker for The Narrow Road to the Deep North about the Burma Railway.
Yes, I have read that because when it won the Booker, we read it. And reading this, I was reminded of how much I'd enjoyed that because, of course, there's a lot of crossover between those books. And it felt nice. I was like, oh, yeah, this is what I loved. You know, he's such a good storyteller. And this particular subject he writes about so well.
That's the book that engendered the most discussion in our book club this year.
If I wasn't that well prepared for some of the other categories, for example, nonfiction, I do feel like with Best Genre Novel, we have a wide range of books to choose from. Very long list.
It has been the year, hasn't it? Best Genre Novel or Comfort Read.
Now, what I'm wondering is whether or not you and I might have some alignment here.
Of course, because you can't see what I've got written down in front of me. You better go first with yours then, and we'll see if I can chime in.
All right. As mentioned, I read a lot of genre fiction this year. So I read a lot of romance, all the Emily Henry books. I read Yulin Kwang's How to End a Love Story. I read Rainbow Rowell's Slow Dance. I'm looking around me because these are the books I keep picking up at the grocery store. I also read a lot of science fiction. Not so much fantasy, actually, but a lot of science fiction, partially thanks to the good people at Elliott Bay Bookstore in Seattle, who never point me astray. And then just some comfort cozy reads. Yes, it was a long list to get through. But my best genre novel of the year is actually a novella, and there's 7 of them.
Hey.
And that is the Murderbot series by Martha Wells.
They are so great.
They are the perfect 1 to 2 hour read. They're about Murderbot, who is a robot programmed to murder. They're a security robot, and they accompany corporate spaceships that head down to planets to assess whether or not they could be good for resource extraction or if they could be made habitable. And so Murderbot has a control placed in them that they have to follow set commands. But when we meet Murderbot, they have just hacked their control. And what they do with this freedom is watch endless television shows while fulfilling their basic duties. But they also begin to form attachments to some of the characters on their mission. And so when things go pear-shaped and Murderbot is free to make choices for themselves, they do that. I think what's so great about this is it's all action. And at the same time, it's really about Murderbot thinking through how they want to be. And this is a robot, but this novel is really all about humanity. And it's the counter to this assumption that if there was true artificial intelligence, that it would somehow be evil and out to get us. This is the opposite. This is almost saying, humanity, that's just you reflecting out on AI. In fact, AI might be miles ahead of us in terms of ethical, moral behavior, not driven by the same impulses. Loved these books. I wonder if she's going to do any more. I did feel like they came to a bit of a close in book 7. They weren't feeling quite as fresh, but such a good read. And you know what? If you haven't read them and you're going to buy them, just get the box set. I really regret not getting the box set and just investing like up front because I don't have a full set now. And I'm annoyed because I feel like they are the kind of books that you might just whip out. I need something to take me away and just reread them again.
My favorite, because they are quite short. I remember when you originally told me about them, you said it's almost like watching a really good episode of something. And they have that. They're very satisfying, but they're short and they're contained. But there's one of them, I think it might be book 5 or book 3, that is longer. It's a proper 300-page novel. And that was my favorite of all of them, mainly because it's longer and she has more time to explore it. But they go on this journey through space on this transport ship. And the transport ship has a personality. There's a kind of AI that runs the transport ship. He's called Art. And their dysfunctional relationship is one of the all-time brilliant love-hate friendships ever. I was so captivated by it. I loved it. And then Art comes back in a later book and you're like, yay! You just want them to get back together again. But no, I think Martha Wells has moved on. I actually was idly looking her up and she's just brought out a new fantasy book. Apparently it's the first for 10 years after the Murderbot books. It's a proper fantasy. Kai's having a long day in Martha Wells's Witch King, it's called. After being murdered, his consciousness dormant and unaware of the passing of time while confined in an elaborate water trap, Kai wakes to find a lesser mage attempting to harness Kai's magic to his own advantage. That was never going to go well. But why was Kai imprisoned in the first place? What has changed in the world since his assassination? And why does the Rising World Coalition appear to be growing in influence? Kai will need to pull his allies close and draw on all his pain magic if he is to answer even the least of these questions. He's not going to like the answers. And I was like, ooh, I could be there for that. The mood I'm in right now.
Yeah. Absolutely. I did just see that it is being adapted into an Apple.
Oh, of course. Because when you read them, you feel like, you almost feel like you're watching them when you read them. So it seemed a complete no-brainer that it would be adapted. I wonder, I would be wary of an adaptation in case it wasn't as good.
Well, partially because our main character is a robot. So there's not a lot going on.
It's funny because
in terms of dynamic facial expressions, it's all in their
when
head.
they get upset, they spend a lot of time just staring at walls. And in the book, that's very expressive and beautifully done. I just wonder how that would translate to live action.
All right. What's your best genre novel? If it wasn't the Murderbot series,
I actually, they were the first thing I thought of when I looked back over my spreadsheet. I was like, oh, the Murderbot books, they were so great. I also very recently, I think in a bit of a sort of reaction to all those Booker novels on the trot, it does something to my brain when I read that much highbrow literary fiction in one go. And I idly started reading this fantasy series. They're called the Alex Verus novels, and there are 12 of them. I read the Kindle sampler book one, and I was just actually a bit curious because they're set in Camden, which is the area of North London where I live. It's where the main character lives, and it's real world, but it's one of those things where it's the real world, but there's the kind of magical side that no one knows about. And this main character is a part of this magical world. And so he runs a magic shop. It's a bit of a front. People go there thinking it's like novelty joke items, and actually there's a section at the back where there's like actual stuff that really works. And his ability is that he can see the future. He can look ahead in time, and he can see all the possibilities of what's going to happen at any given moment. And depending on what's happening around him and the situation he's in, he can look further ahead or not very far ahead, depending on how uncertain the situation is. I almost thought it was going to get old, that I would get my head around it and it would get a bit boring because he can only really do the one thing. But I just thought, the way the author, Benedict Jacker, who I've just got so much respect for, the way he takes this one thing and then develops that. But the thing is, it's a slow burn. You do have to get in on the ground floor, I think, because I'm on book 10 now. And let me tell you, things evolve. And gradually, with each succeeding book, there's like another layer of complexity. And suddenly there's a new level of nuance to this magical world. And suddenly there's like a new realm that they're going into, and you've got this core, almost like the found family aspect to it, which I really love. These sort of core characters who are the most meaningful to him. But also, there's characters that pop up in book 1. By book 10, you can't quite believe, did he plan all this out? Just where they end up. It's so surprising, and so it's just really rich. Honestly, if I had to compare it to anything, at this point, it's War and Peace. Because it's got very political and strategic, and our main character is quite powerful now, so the stakes are much, much higher. I have been reading like a teenager. I just absolutely been devouring them. For whatever reason, at this particular exact moment in my life on what I'm looking for in a book, they delivered everything I wanted and more, and I actually had to really firmly be like, you know what? There are other books I want to be reading before the end of the year. I want to read the Olga Tokarczuk. I actually would really love to read Sally Rooney's Intermezzo. And I've got a copy of Hisham Matar's My Friends, which comes hugely endorsed by Phil Martin. And I want to read those books. And so I'm just saving the last ones, I think. I'm saving them for when I need them. I don't know if it's just me. that somehow they were just exactly what I wanted, or whether anyone would like them. I think they're popular. They're out there.
Maybe I'll have to dabble, but not soon, because we're trying to get away from my genre reading habits.
Yeah. Maybe we can start a new podcast, Kate and Laura on the favourite genre
Our
reads.
guilty reads.
But you mustn't call them guilty pleasures, because people get very upset about it. People think we shouldn't feel guilty about. And it's true. Where does the guilt come in? What is this? What standard are we holding ourselves to?
No, it's not guilt, but it's about the difference in terms of how you feel afterwards. You put it quite eloquently earlier. And maybe this is a good preamble to our best book of the year. It's about the novels or memoirs or nonfiction that fill your boots up and you feel enriched. And when you think back about them, you feel enriched, as opposed to that was a delicious bag of candy and I loved it at that time. But now here I am. Nothing about me has changed.
I know we're going to do Book of the Year, and that, of course, is the most important thing. But really quickly, it just popped into my mind because talking about genre novels, The Husbands by Holly Gramazio, which is really fun, inventive, romantic comedy about a woman who... Well, it's not really a romantic comedy, actually. It's about a woman who discovers that her attic is generating husbands for her. And through the contrivances of the plot, she realizes that every time the man that she's currently living with goes up into the attic and comes down, he comes down different. He is a completely different person. But the scenario, the fact that she's married to this individual, is always the same. It sounds a bit nuts, but there's a sequence of events that gets her into this position in the first place. And it actually all does make sense, the way that she's woven it together. And she has so much fun with this. What if this main character had got together with this person? What if they got together with this person? And again, just as I've thought, I've really got my head around this attic thing now, I'm getting a bit bored with this, there's such a good twist that really then I was like, whoa, hang on a minute, and then was completely invested in it all again. It doesn't outstay its welcome. It was a great, good, really felt very pacey, dynamic, a lot of fun, laugh out loud funny sometimes. And I thought she took this premise that she set herself. She's someone who's very interested in video game design outside of her writing life. And I thought she really saw it through and executed it in a way that was great. It really worked. So I loved it. Everyone gets their genre kicks in different places. For Book Club Q, it was Our Share of the Night by Mariana Enriquez.
I'm a huge fan of her. I will read everything by her.
Right?
Yeah, she's very interesting. She's Argentinian. I think she's previously done a bunch of short story collections, which I also recommend. But this is the first actual page turner. You got horror, you got a satanic cult, you got a magical door, you got a haunted house. It's set mostly in Argentina, sometimes in London, and it's really centered around the dictatorship and people disappearing. I think a lot of it comes from that type of influence. Obviously, it's fantasy and horror and stuff in there, but she's also gross, like it's very bodily. That appeals to me because she really hits all your senses. You can really feel it. I sometimes feel like if I'm going to go through that genre, and I don't read a lot of those genre, I want to be immersed completely. Like if you're just going to do it all the way versus like half. You're going to make me sit through it, make me sick.
Meanwhile, Karen was disappointed by the most recent in Louise Penny's best-selling Inspector Gamache series.
I've loved her crime series, and she's on her 19th book. She took a couple years off, and she just published the 19th one this year. It's called The Gray Wolf. The series has been so great. She really focuses on a lot of culture and a lot of food, and so it has been a comfort series for me. But The Gray Wolf just came out and it went, just fell really flat. And I've heard this from a couple of other people. I mean, you know, there are peaks and valleys with 19 books. You can imagine that some are better than others. But, I was so looking forward to The Gray Wolf. And, but all the backlist up until now, it's just been a really great series. And genre comfort all rolled up into one.
That. All right, come on. Let's stop procrastinating. Come on, Laura, try and stay focused. Best book of the year. I wonder if...
Am I going first?
Yeah. Again, I wonder whether we might have the same book.
I don't think so.
Let me get the obvious one out of the way. So the obvious one I'm holding up is James by Percival Everett. It didn't win the Booker. I loved Orbital, the book that won. I was very happy for that as a win. I thought it felt right that book won this year. It wasn't what I expected, but it felt like the right choice. I do objectively think that James was the finest novel on that shortlist, and it was surprising that it didn't win. And I was very pleased to see that it won the National Book Award in America, because it's just a brilliantly thought through and executed novel. It is a retelling of the story of Huckleberry Finn, but from the point of view of Jim, who's the slave who helps Huck escape down the river. Here, he is the main character. And we talked about it masses on our Booker show, but as Sarah put it very well, here he's a man. He's a fully realised man with hopes and dreams and fears, and you feel incredibly invested in him and you care about what happens to him. And it was just absolutely brilliantly done. But my best book, I think, the reason it came down to this one is because after I finished it, I talked to someone and I was just like, this book was everything I wanted a novel to be. It was just perfect. I closed it and thought, that was such a good novel. And then I couldn't remember what book I said that about. And I was asking the book club last night, and Andrew, one of the book clubbers, he's like, that was the Heaven and Earth grocery store. You said that about the Heaven and Earth grocery store, which we read for book club. This is by James McBride. I did love it. It was an excellent book club book. It was a really great discussion book, but I just thought, such a fantastic read. I was so happy I read it. It's set in the 1930s in Pennsylvania, in a suburb called Chicken Hill, which is a suburb of this industrial town called Pottstown. You meet the two main communities who live in this poor neighborhood. It's the Jewish community and the African American community. All of that was really interesting, like all of the different nuances of people's sense of identity and belonging was beautifully done. It's very funny. It's very poignant. The dialogue is fantastic. You believe in these characters. You care about these characters. It's quite complicated. There's quite a lot going on. This is a plotty book. There's a whole thing about a boy who's taken away by the authorities, and the community are coming together to try and get him back. And they don't have much power, and they certainly don't have any influence. So it's about what can they do to right this wrong. It's so cleverly structured. I thought it really is so well done. And at the end, when you read the author's afterword, you read about the real life people that he has encountered who sparked these ideas that are brought to life in the novel. And it's about kindness and community and people doing things altruistically and bringing good into the world. And when I finished it, I already loved it. But then when I read that afterword and found these real world connections, it just meant a lot to me. It meant a lot to me to read this book. It gave me hope, and it reminded me about all the good things that happen in the world and the times that people come together and they transcend difficult circumstances to make change. It was just great. It sold 1 million copies in America, probably more. He's not so well known here, I don't think, but I hope that lots of people in the UK read this as well, because it's such a great book. I loved it.
I'm glad you brought it up again. I do want to read it. James was good. Objectively, James might be the best book of 2024. It's just not my best book of 2024. And my best book of 2024, I have spoken about this year because it featured in our discussion of the New York Times best books of the 21st century, where we gave our own best books. And I think at the time I acknowledged a recency bias because it was a recent read that I loved. And that is Real Estate by Deborah Levy.
Oh,
I love this book. I feel like I don't want to meet Deborah Levy. I don't want to see her talk. I want her to exist on the page and page alone, because there it feels to me like, this is very cheesy, but like coming home. I don't know. It feels like almost like reading about how you want to understand yourself or how you want to think about the world. She's so smart and funny and acute, while also having this, and I say this totally without judgment, like this sort of frivolous streak to her that I really relate to. What is the meaning of life? It could be great shoes, but she pairs all that with a deep examination of philosophy. And in this case, the second living autobiography, she's preoccupied with real estate, or this idea that a woman needs a room of her own to write in. Deborah Levy has written 3 living autobiographies, and I read them in quite a confusing order. I read the second when I was on parental leave. It was COVID, and I was just pushing my baby around Walthamstow and listening to the second memoir. It holds a special place in my heart. And then for whatever reason, I never went back to the first. And it was only when I saw that my mum had the third and final edition that I picked it up. In the second one, she's really musing on her divorce. She separated from her husband, who was a playwright. And she doesn't say this explicitly, but it's woven throughout that in that separation, her two daughters being in their late teens, only then was she able to fulfill her potential as a writer. That's a very powerful thread in these memoirs about the potential to have the richest years of your life after 50. And in real estate, she does go out dancing on her 65th birthday at the coolest nightclub in Paris. So there's a little bit of wish fulfillment too, where you're just like, gosh, I just want to be Deborah Levy when I'm older. She's such
if you're
a role
casting
model.
around for role models of sort of women who are ahead of you, like further down the track, she's great.
I was talking about this book with my book club, some of the women in my book club, and we did wonder whether or not these memoirs would resonate with everyone, no matter where you are. Deborah Levy lives in North London, and so there's something very much of that place, and I lived in North London for many years. I just adore it. It's my best book. And I would love men to read it, because I think there's something in it that is so refreshing and counter to, not to sound pretentious, but the patriarchal assumptions about how one should live one's life, or the capitalistic assumptions about how one should live and measure one's life. It's a great book, and I think it's one I'll return to again and again.
Love those books. I've got her latest collection, which is called The Intimacies of Spoons, I want to say, which is, I think, a series of essays and pieces that were published in magazines and things like that that have been collected up. It seems to have had positive reviews. I don't think people are raving about it in the same way that people love those living autobiography books, but I suppose if you love Levy, you love her voice, you're going to be happy. This is like another collection. And that central one, the one about spoons, I think is the standout. Anyway, it's also on my list of things I want to read, which is why I have to stop powering through all these fantasy reads.
Okay, I do want to go back to that. There's 12 books, and have you read 10 of them in the last month?
No, Laura, in a week and a half.
Kate, how long
They're
are
about
they?
350 pages each. They're not that short. And I was
Is this why you're messaging me at 1 a.m. your time?
I think to myself, I could have read Proust. This is why War and Peace feels like the right comparison to me. I can't
I am very intrigued, but I am not going to get into a 12-book series. That is not what I can dig myself into heading into the Christmas holidays.
I think, try the first one if you feel so inclined. Actually, even I wouldn't say, I think you have to stick with it a little bit, because the character at the beginning, you don't necessarily like him that much. He's a little bit annoying. You will only enjoy the later books if you have put in the time with the earlier ones. Because, of course, that's what I think is so brilliant. I suppose that's why I'm so interested, is the way it evolves, and realizing that if you stick with things in that way, it builds up, or if you're committed to something in that way. Maybe that is why people like Proust so much. Maybe people feel the same.
I don't think so.
So that feels like a very good selection. Maybe a little bit, not necessarily the obvious choices for best books of the year, but
it was a weird year for reading. I would like to get more on track.
That's the thing. I suppose that's what I'm wondering, is intentions for next year. I need to figure out how to carve out more time for reading, I think, than I've managed this year, because it just feels a bit frustrating. Not that it's like, oh, you have to get through so many books, but more that I love this activity and I want to be able to spend more of my time doing it than I think I've been able to this year. Although that said, I can clearly carve out the time to read 10 Alex Vieras books. I put my mind to it. But yeah, I think I'm feeling very much like I would love to try and do Oliver Burkeman, we haven't talked about. One of the things that I found quite helpful in the Meditations of Mortals is this idea of daily-ish. So instead of setting yourself a rule, I will read for an hour every day. I will get up at 6 instead of 7, and I will read for an hour first thing in the morning. For me, I could already say that would never work. But maybe instead of that intention of I will do this every day, and then quite quickly you end up failing at it and suddenly the whole resolution's collapsed around your ears, you set a flexible intention, which is that I'm going to try and do this thing daily-ish. I'm going to try and read for 30 minutes every day, daily-ish. And if you manage it, if you manage to get through a week where maybe you've read 5 days out of 7, you're doing really well. Whereas if you've only managed to do that a couple of days out of 7, you might think, oh, I'm not doing very well with my daily-ish, and just nudge it up. And whether that might be a more realistic way of giving yourself that little mental nudge that you've got this intention, you have got this thing that you said you wanted to do, and are you managing to do it? I always read. Every day I will always read before I go to bed. For me, the challenge is, can I find any other time in the day to read?
I also think that's part of my problem, though, is at the end of the day, it's hard to start a new book, right? And if that's always when you're reading, which in my case it is, you gravitate to something that's easy and accessible or known rather than having the bandwidth and like mental energy to get into something that asks you to think, but then rewards you in the long term. My strategy for next year is to read fewer new books, fewer new releases, and to read books by authors that I have enjoyed already, or where I don't think the book was perfect, but I know they can write and I'm curious. For example, Rebecca Mackey, who I mentioned earlier, who wrote The Great Believers, and I have some questions for you. We nailed it, Kate. I haven't read The Great Believers, and everyone says it's better than I have some questions for you. So I'm like, oh, okay, I should do that. Rachel Kushner, we read Creation Lake by her, which was on the Booker shortlist. We didn't think it was great, but you know what? I still am very glad I read it. And I think it was very well written and entertaining. So I'm like, okay, I should read some more Rachel Kushner. I also want to read more Brits again. I feel like it's harder to get a wide range of British fiction in North America, just full stop. America's right next door and it's really dominant and they have the best bookshops too. I think I would like to read less American fiction, which is not hating on American fiction. It's just acknowledging that that offers one cultural perspective, one lens, even when it doesn't seem like the lens is the same because the authors or the characters are from very different backgrounds. I don't know. There's just something about it that sets it apart. Maybe I need to alternate. Genre fiction, significant fiction. Genre fiction, significant fiction.
Don't make it a rule. Just plan to alternate-ish. What doesn't change is my huge pleasure and delight in swapping notes about books with you. And hopefully the listeners enjoy that too. We're certainly planning to do plenty more of them next year. And I'm excited about what 2025 brings.
Me too.
That's nearly it for this episode. You'll find all the books mentioned in the show notes. If you've spent the Christmas season running around, seeing friends and family, sorting out presents, wrapping presents, cooking, cleaning, tidying, maybe even, the dream, squeezing in a bit of reading, perhaps you might want to give yourself a present. How about membership to the Book Club Review Patreon? In addition to the various special episodes you'll find on there, you'll get the Book Club Review Weekend, my weekly-ish bonus episode just for patrons, featuring Laura's reading updates and regular chats with friends of the pod. Listen in as Phil and I try to understand the somewhat shadowy process of choosing a Nobel Prize for Literature winner. Or hear from Anna of Aussie podcast Books on the Go on the year she stopped buying new books to focus on getting through her TBR. How about that as an idea for January? And just out, listen to my extra favourites, the books I didn't get to squeeze into this episode, and my other cultural highlights from the year gone by, including podcast recommendations and even a film. Also discover a few more details about those comfort reads of Laura's and find out why Phil Chafee's resolution is to read less in 2025. You'll get all that at the entry level, but at the higher tier you can also join the Podcast Book Club and come and talk books with me in person at the end of every month over Zoom, or listen back anytime if you can't make the live session. In January, we're reading the novel that appeared on many a Best of the Year list, Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, in which a newly sober, orphan son of Iranian immigrants, guided by the voices of artists, poets and kings, embarks on a remarkable search for a family secret. In February, we're reading All the Beauty in the World by Patrick Bringley, a museum guard's quest to find solace and meaning in art. And in March, it's short stories with Hateship, Friendship, Loveship, Courtship, Marriage by Alice Munro. I've never read any Munro, and I'm delighted to finally be getting the nudge I need to experience this Nobel Prize winner's work. But will these three make for good book club reads? Join me and the book clubbers over on Patreon and find out. Give yourself the present of membership. Join our bookish community, get brilliant book recommendations, and get the warm glow from knowing that you're supporting me in making the show. Head to patreon.com/The Book Club Review and sign up today. As for this episode, find full show notes over at thebookclubreview.co.uk, including details for the Serious Readers Lamps offer. Don't forget, you can visit seriousreaders.com/BCR and use the code BCR at checkout for £100 off their brilliant HV lights. Come and find me anytime on Instagram at Book Club Review Podcast, and Laura and I will be back soon with our bookish plans and projects for 2025. Until then, I wish you a happy new year and happy book clubbing.